All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. So great to have so many groups joining us, both on camera today and live via YouTube as we continue the learning from home. So normally we'll be broadcasting live to classrooms across North America, which is why it's so great to be able to continue doing this, broadcasting live into the homes of educators, students, and of course, parents across North America. So we've got a really great event lined up for today. As a diver myself, I'm really excited to introduce Chris Kraska today. He's been a public school teacher in Cleveland, Ohio for nearly 20 years. He became involved in marine archaeology through citizen science in 2006 and served as the chairman of the Ohio Maritime Archaeological Survey team for 6 years. He's participated in numerous archaeological investigations throughout Lake Erie, serving as survey diver as well as project manager. He's a member of the Ohio Archaeological Council, the Explorers Club, and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in the UK. Chris, it's so great to have you joining us live today. We're excited to dive into some of your adventures.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here. So welcome to everybody all over the world. From what I can see, I've got a couple of screenshots that I can see folks in Hamburg and Lord knows where else on this beautiful Earth Day morning. By the way, happy Earth Day, everybody. It is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and I'm excited to be here today with you. So my topic today is maritime archaeology, which is essentially archaeology that deals with how humans interact with the seafaring environment, how people have traveled the world over time on the oceans, and how ships are used, and what those activities have left behind and what we can investigate and find out as a result of those investigations. So for hundreds of years, perhaps a lot longer, people have wondered about diving beneath the sea. On the screen is an early design of Leonardo da Vinci's proposing one way that he could have dove to the bottom of the sea. We have people like Jules Verne, who was a visionary in the late 1800s and came up with this idea of actually living beneath the sea and farming beneath the sea. And of course, we have the reality of today, which is technical diving, which involves very complicated materials, equipment, a lot of training and expertise necessary to get down deep. But not everything that we do as maritime archaeologists involves being super deep. But what's the fascination of the ocean? Why is it so remote and why is it so out there, so to speak? So if we take a look at this map, it's actually a side view of the deepest point of the ocean to the shallowest points. And you can see that there's an inverted picture of Mount Everest on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can see that Mount Everest inverted is actually not even as deep as the deepest point in the ocean. And if you look way up in the left-hand corner of the screen, there's where I live, right by Lake Erie. There's a little tiny shallow thing that looks almost like a kiddie swimming pool up on the left-hand side of the screen. And that is where I do most of my work. And as you can see, it's only a maximum of about 210 feet deep. So it's very, very shallow compared to the rest of the ocean. So people have walked on the moon. How many people have walked on the moon? Well, in reality, 12 people have since the first moon landings in 1969. We didn't really go back. We haven't been back since the years in between. We had about 12 people total during all the Apollo missions ending in 1974. But the people who've been to the Challenger Deep, or the deepest point of the ocean, there are only 4 of those to date, which is fascinating to think of. 2 of them went in 1960. One, James Cameron, the director, went in 2012. And just last fall, Victor Vescovo descended again to the deepest point of the ocean, almost 11,000 meters. So it's amazing to think that more than, or 3 times as many people have been on the moon that have been to the deepest point of the ocean. So when we look at technology in maritime archaeology, obviously you have to be able to get under the water. So we have to be able to dive. And then this screen here is an illustration of one of the earliest uses of computer-assisted design in underwater archaeology or maritime archaeology. And this is from the early 80s. And you can see the computer images look really primitive compared to what we have today. And I'll show you some of those later. But this was one of the very earliest uses of mapping technology using computer-assisted design in maritime archaeology from the HMS Pandora wreck from the early 1980s off of Australia. So I became involved in maritime archaeology through citizen science. Citizen science, according to National Geographic, is the practice of public participation and collaboration in scientific research to increase scientific knowledge. Through citizen science, people share and contribute to data monitoring and collection programs. So what that means is we take everyday people like you guys, my friends in Hamburg at the bottom of the screen. Young people, if you're old enough to dive, you're old enough to do underwater archaeology. And we even have people who are not necessarily divers who get involved in our programs. So There's organizations worldwide. The Nautical Archaeology Society, which is based out of the UK, is a very popular one with members worldwide, seminars all over the world, very strong foothold in Canada, very popular in Canada with our friends in Ontario who do a lot of shipwreck preservation up there. In St. Augustine, Florida, the Lighthouse Maritime Project, the LAMP project, takes young people and introduces them to maritime archaeology in Florida. Now, this is just two examples. There are programs like this all over the world where you can get involved as school-age children in actually doing some of the research and finding out what it's like, what it takes to be a maritime archaeologist. And like I said, and like Joe said in the introduction, I'm actually a school teacher. And for 20 years, I've been teaching public school children. So this is something that I do for fun. And because as a young kid, I was always fascinated in history, in the natural world, and there's a personal connection with me that you'll learn about in a few minutes, which I think you're going to find pretty cool. So in about 2006, my father-in-law at the time told me about this program that was put on by this group here in Ohio called MAST. And it was a seminar that I went to. It was a weekend event. We learned the basics of maritime archaeology. And what the MAST group does, and I was a member, I still am a member, but I started in about 2006 with them, is they take these historic shipwreck moorings, these buoys. And what we do is we find sites that are threatened or in danger of destruction or damage. And we take these buoys and we actually put them on the wreck sites so that if divers would like to come and see the sites that we've surveyed or some of the sites that we've investigated, they can do so without damaging the wrecks. And what they do is they actually, if you look at the photograph to the right of the screen, they use their boats lines to actually hook up to a tag line or that blue line at the top of the white float so that they can attach their boat, their vessel, to the mooring block, which is this huge concrete block that sits on the bottom of the lake. And that allows them to dive on the site without the potential damage of dropping anchor and dragging the wreck, pulling pieces off the wreck. These wrecks are all very fragile. Many of them are wood from the mid to late and early 1800s, and they can be severely damaged just by dropping an anchor on them. So to date, right now, MAST, the group that I was involved with, has 11 shipwreck moorings in Lake Erie, mostly around the Cleveland area, which is where I live. And you can see here they're listed 1 to 11, and their locations are on the map. And this is available if you were to search for MAST Maritime Archaeology on the web also, this would pop up. There's also a shipwreck preservation program in Ontario, which actually predates the MAST program, I believe. So another thing that we do with the shipwreck surveys is we provide dive slates. And this is what's called a dive slate. It's produced on a piece of plastic. And divers that want to dive the wreck and see exactly what the parts of the wreck are can take this as they go on their wreck, hook it to your gear, to a D-ring, and actually flip it up and be able to dive around the wreck site and look and see the various features on the wreck and be able to determine what it is they're looking at. So we have these workshops yearly. Unfortunately, this year's workshop was canceled. It was scheduled for right about this time, late April, and we had to cancel it, of course, due to COVID-19. We usually have between 30 and 40 people that come. We have different levels. We have people as young as 12, 16 taking the class and participating in some of the survey techniques. So this is kind of interesting. If you look at the pictures, what we do for the training in order to teach people to be able to map out shipwrecks is first we do it on dry land. So we'll take various bits and pieces and we'll lay it out as if it's a shipwreck and then teach them how to do the actual data recording and what that looks like on dry land, because diving is hard enough on its own. When you task load or you take more than one thing and you learn how to do diving and doing measurements and using a pencil underwater and writing on a clipboard and all these other things, it compounds the difficulty level. And it can be quite daunting a lot of times without a lot of experience for people. We do an in-water training, and that's typically when it warms up, which here in Ohio is about mid-May, typically just after Mother's Day at one of the quarries here in Ohio. And then once the divers go down and practice, they come up and they plot out their data points on a piece of paper. They transfer their wet notes, which is actually written with a pencil on Mylar, which is a waterproof plastic. They'll transfer it to real paper and practice drawing out the site map. And for those of you who are doing geometry, one of the main technique we use when we plot wreck sites is trilateration, which is a planimetric procedure. So in other words, it's single plane, it's flat, like you can see the paper on the screen, and we measure from a reference point. So we'll set a baseline out. If you saw on that dry line or that dry practice shot, there was a large tape down the middle of the room. That's your baseline. You lay that on the wreck, and then you measure from a known point on the baseline to an unknown point that you want to plot. For instance, the tip of an anchor, you would measure it from one point, you would move down several feet and measure it from another point. And that way, when you take your compass and you lay it out on the paper and you reproduce that to scale on the paper, you can find the exact point and reference scale down onto the drawing that you're producing. It's a fascinating procedure. So how do we find shipwrecks? Most of the shipwreck finding that's done nowadays is either by accident or people who are purposely searching. So if you take a look at this image, you see there's a boat at the top with a GPS antenna, and they have a tow fish that's suspended from a line behind the boat that actually produces a sound wave. And what the sound wave does is it acts almost like a flashlight. So it's illuminating what you can't see. And the sound is actually showing up. And if you look at this image, this is a side scan image of the Salton, which was one of the wrecks that I worked on. You'll see what looks like a shadow to the left of the wreck. And that is actually the shadow of the railing. So the railing that you would have held onto on the wreck. And that shadow is being produced by the sonar, which is spread out. To the right of the screen is actually the center line of this side scan sonar. Because the sonar, if you take a look at the previous slide, shoots to both sides, there's a dead zone in the center. There's that light spot that comes down, or it's produced a dark spot on the actual sonar image that doesn't show up. So that's one of the drawbacks with side scan sonar, is it does produce that dead zone. But today's technology is amazing. It's come so far from what it was just a few years ago. So this is a typical, not typical actually, this is a very detailed initial drawing of a site plan that Kevin McGee with CLUE, the Cleveland Underwater Explorers, produced. And this was from just a couple dives when the wreck was first discovered back in about 2011. You can see he noted that there's a lot of grindstones on this wreck. Those are those round things that look like wheels all the way down the starboard side or the right side of the ship. And he's pointed out all the features on here. This is a really nice and detailed map, an initial survey, so you can see exactly what it is you're looking at, including a designation on the bottom that has a direction pointing north. So you can see exactly the way the ship lies. So this is in-water survey activity, divers going down in teams of 2, doing their work and coming back up, recording their details. This is all done with a very strict safety protocol. I served as a dive safety officer on boats, as well as project manager, and we really, safety is number one. We have procedures for everything. We have limits of time. This wreck was only 45 feet deep, so divers were allowed 30 minutes on the wreck, and then they were to surface, have their surface interval, which is the time above water between dives, in order to off-gas any accumulated nitrogen in your body tissues, just for safety's sake, and then go back down and do their second dive of the day. So this is kind of a typical dive on Lake Erie. If you watch closely, you will see that it's very green. The reason for this is that we have a lot of algae in Lake Erie, and it's gotten worse over the years. We have algae blooms that come periodically. If you look right here, the tag that I just touched was actually number 10, and that's actually a cow ear tag that they use. And it's one of the things that we find makes the best markers on shipwrecks, because they last long and you can zip tie them onto the wreck. So in this case, this particular wreck that we were working on, we were using those cow tags, which we've been using since about 2011. And I'll record my data on the data sheet and then later on plot it on the top side. So this next slide is, this is the layout of the Salton, and there's a lot of math involved here. As you can see, there's a lot of points. The points to the top that say CP 100 and CP 101, those are the points where we initially stuck rods in the bottom of the lake and used those as fixed points to measure everything else on the wreck. We put all these data tags up and down the wreck, and then we're able to do the measurements from those data bars. In this case, here's a diver doing measurements on the side of the Salton. Here's a bow view of the wreck. You can see how green it was. This was in July, so we still had quite a bit of green algae blooms. This wreck went down in 1864, by the way, with a loss of all hands, all 7, after coming out during a storm out of Cleveland. It's known as the grindstone wreck because of all the grindstones. There we are on the boat, plotting data. Here's some images from the wreck itself. A diver looking into one of the cargo hatches. There's a Woodstock anchor at the upper right. It's a very unusual anchor. It's very period typical as far as the way it's constructed, with that heavy metal ring that would secure to the anchor chain. On the bottom left is that railing that you were able to see with the shadow from the sonar coming through it. And on the bottom right is something that at first looks like a human skull. And it's a fascinating thing in maritime archaeology. These are called dead eyes. And what a dead eye is it's actually a wooden block, and it's fastened to the hull of the vessel using what's called a chain plate. And then the rigging lines travel through what looks like the eyes and the nose of the dead eye to secure the rigging in place. There was a TV report that showed a new website that came out illustrating Ohio shipwrecks, and they actually said that it was a human skull because nobody had told them that it was part of the rigging. So here's some more photographs of some of the type of artifacts that we found on the Salton. On the upper left-hand side, you can see a spanner, what we Americans call a wrench. On the right-hand side on top, you can see a big stack of the grindstones and also a piece of a crock that someone has put there. Divers, unfortunately, when they go to sites, sometimes they move things around. And it's something that we don't encourage. If you're down there and you see it, that's great. Take photos of it and whatnot. But if you move things around, when we do the surveys, it kind of loses the context and we might not be able to figure out where things were supposed to be. The bottom left, there's a piece of stoneware, china, and we were actually able to date that to the early 1860s. And it was one of the things that helped us definitively identify the wreck. So there's a lot of data and there's a lot of fascinating information out there. This is one of my favorite images. This is a 360-degree image, 360 sonar, so 360 degrees. If you look about 2/3 of the way back on the wreck, you'll see a circle with some little light-colored dots. That's where the tripod drops down, and we actually lowered it down from the surface. And the tripod landed on the deck, and then a sonar camera spun 360 degrees and made this image. And we did it from several positions and made a big composite, but it's one of the technologies that we use that's able to be used to hundreds and hundreds of feet that we were able to use on the Salton. And here was the final revised site plan that I made with the pieces and parts as they were at the time of the investigation. The wreck site has changed since then, as wooden wrecks do. They're going to silt in, mud is going to accumulate, wood is going to deteriorate. So it's just a matter of time before these things are gone. So that's one of the reasons that we make the records that we do, in order to have this for future people to look back, and kids like you and parents and whoever's interested to say, hey, this is really neat stuff. We can still look and see what it was like. Recently, Ohio has put out this Shipwrecks and Maritime Tales page. It's fascinating. You can go there and click on it, and it actually has, matter of fact, I'm going to do that now and see if I can get out to it. And if you look, you can see they actually show the different sections. And so you could pick, oh, I want to look and see what's around Cleveland. And then you would click on that, and it would show all these wrecks, including the wreck of the Salton, which was my wreck that we investigated in 2012. And that would come up, and you would be able to see all the photos, the story of the loss with the history. I mean, these things are being cataloged in greater and greater numbers. And it's really quite fascinating to see the amount of data that's being put on the web, so that people in the future will be able to look back and see all the things that have been done. So I'm going to try to move along at a good clip because I've got a lot to go. The Lake Serpent was discovered a couple years ago, and it was discovered by Tom Kowalczyk from Clue, doing regular sonar sweeps of Lake Erie. And they weren't sure it was the Lake Serpent at first. They found this sonar image. They looked at it. It was off of Kelly's Island, which is in Ohio. If you've ever been down to Cedar Point, which is a great amusement park in Ohio, this is not far from Cedar Point. And they weren't sure at first. It was a small ship, only about 45 feet, but they did some research. This is one of the dives on it. This is a typical dive. This is actually not the worst dive on the Lake Serpent that I've been on. Turn down the volume a little bit. So if you watch closely, the group set up a dredge. This was in partnership with Cleveland Underwater Explorers and the National Museum of the Great Lakes. So we set up this dredge. There you see my hand on the dredge line, the pump line. And what the dredge does is it actually sucks the mud and the silt off the dive site and pushes it farther away, 100 feet down the water, down the current, so that you can actually see what's going on and be able to dig in and find some of the artifacts. So there's a dredge line attached to the wreck. This was not a great dive. So I'm going to skip to a better dive. This one was actually shot by my friend Dave Van Zant. This is a much better dive. And I know that at first it looks very green, and you wouldn't think, oh, this is a great dive. We'll get down to the wreck here. This lasts about 1.5 minutes, and there's something that's really cool that I'll tell you about. The water's only about 45 feet deep. It's fairly chilly, but in the summer, It was lovely. On my second dive, I actually dove a short dry suit. So like shorts and a short top, it was so warm in the water. And one of the things is when you're working on a wreck, you're moving a lot. So you're actually creating heat rather than diving kind of like doing nothing and getting cold. So this was one of the most fascinating things on this wreck. And this was one of the reasons we were able to almost definitively identify it. This is the bowsprit. And right now it just looks like this weird piece of wood that's got a couple slots carved in it. But when we discovered the bowsprit, it really opened up for us what this wreck was, because Tom had done some investigation. And there's Dave drawing a sketch of the bowsprit. And Tom was able to find out that of the ships that this could possibly be, there was one in particular called the Lake Serpent that had in its registry notes listed that it had a serpent as a figurehead. So the figurehead is the bottom, just below the bowsprit, or the pointy part at the front of the boat, the bow of the boat that goes out and holds rigging that comes down. And underneath there, they would put these decorative pieces. And so this one was said to have a serpent. Well, when we looked at it, it didn't really look like a serpent. And everyone said, well, it's not quite what we had in mind for a serpent. I thought it looked like Barney the dinosaur myself. You guys are probably too young for Barney the dinosaur, and then I thought, you know what? During that time, there was a lot of talk of lake monster and Lake Erie. There were these myths and people saying that they were seeing sea serpents. And remember, this was a time of exploration and people would see things frequently that they had no explanation for. And so the more I looked at this and the more I thought about it, I went and did some historical research and found in newspaper archives that yes, in the 1818, 1820, 21 region, there were multiple reports of this Lake Erie monster or this Lake Erie serpent. And so we determined that it wasn't that they were naming it after a snake, which there are plenty of in Lake Erie. We have lots of water snakes, but it was actually, if you look at this 1532 map, I believe by Olaus Magnus, it's called the Carta Marina. You'll see that all over it, there's these little sea monster type creatures, krakens and things with water spouting out of their head. And we did the research. We found the reports of the Lake Erie serpent. Here you can see a representative newspaper clip. And then when I put everything together and kind of looked at it and took these individual images of sea serpents throughout history and what they would have looked like or what people would have perceived them to look like and compared it with the bowsprit from the Lake Serpent, I thought that's what they were trying to show. They weren't trying to show a snake per se. They were trying to show a sea monster or what their idea of a lake serpent would be. There's actually a Science Channel program produced just recently called Shipwreck Secrets, a haunting on Lake Erie, that featured this image that I did for them. So that was something that was really cool to find out and kind of like solve that mystery as why did they name the ship this? You know, it's not uncommon, of course, if you were in Europe to have a Viking boat with a dragon prow, very common, but here in the United States, not very common at all. So it was kind of a neat thing to find out. So that's the Lake Serpent. How are we doing on time, Joe?
Yeah, Chris, go ahead and share another one.
Great. All right. So this is the kind of the last one I'll get into. This was my dad's ship. And this is why I said I had a personal connection. My dad was in World War II. He fought for the Allies in the Polish Navy. And he was on this destroyer escort called L-72 that was given by the British to the Polish Navy that was run out of the UK during World War II. So this is a 3D image that was produced of what the ship would have looked like using 3D software generation. So you can see it was a middle-sized warship. Anybody out there that's World War II buffs, this was in the 1,000 to 2,000 ton range, about 90 meters long, 273 feet. So in 1942, when the Mediterranean was basically shut down by the Axis, by Germany and Italy, they were trying to resupply Malta, and they sent these convoys in and they would take these freighters and guard them to get them to Malta to bring supplies that were needed to maintain the island stronghold. And my dad was in this convoy in 1942, and his ship was actually sunk by a mine right before they got in to port in Malta. This is one of the few ships that actually survived. There was only 2 freighters that made the journey successfully in June of 42. My dad did survive the sinking, obviously, because I'm not that old, but a fascinating thing is that after my dad passed, I was working with MAST in Ohio, and my friend Peter Witkowski came down, who I met at the event. And I told him about my dad's ship and that I'd thought about trying to get some other folks to look for it. Well, Peter said, well, we'll go find it. And I thought, oh yeah, sure we will. And long story short, Peter went and did the hard work. He went to the archives at Kew in the UK and did all this archival research and pulled all these materials and found out exactly the captain's reports and the minefields. And we looked at all the different things that kind of came into play as far as where the ship could be, because nobody had seen it since 1942. We were able to take all these different reports and actually make a determination based on the reports that we had as to where we should be looking. And if you look in the little red box on the bottom, the red box inside the red box, you can see where the actual wreck site was. So it was not terribly far from where all these other reports of mine strikes and where the captain actually reported where his ship was struck. And they spent about 10 days searching for this wreck using a rented sailboat. And on about the 10th day, this is what they found. So this is a side scan sonar image of my father's shipwreck. And I remember distinctly getting the email in 2014, because I was not on the initial search, from Peter saying, "We found your dad's ship." And I was like, "How do you know?" And he sent me the sonar image. Well, sure enough, this was one of the first ROV, or remotely operated vehicle, images from the shipwreck. And it's not a very good image. It's not very clear, but if you look, there's some very distinct features. There's these support structures that are in the shape of X's, and there's these portholes. So I was able to take the original blueprints from the archives, from the manufacturer of the ship, and take it and overlay the image from the ROV and determine that the structural diagnostics were identical. So in other words, the portholes, the location of the support brackets, et cetera, just from this initial image. And I knew that I was looking at a Hunt Type 2 escort destroyer, or at least a Hunt escort destroyer. Destroyer escort, I apologize, destroyer escort. Here's another piece. This was what we first thought was a bench on the wreck. We later found out was what was called a lumber rack. So it was for shoring up pieces that would be damaged during combat, and they would take these pieces of lumber and shore it up. And long story short, this was my father's wreck. It was it's, as far as I know, the only wreck beyond 300 feet currently to have been rendered in 3D without using remote vehicles, only using divers. Kari Heitinen and Dr. Chris Rowland from the University of Dundee actually did the videos that produced this. And they used programs, I believe they use Agisoft Photo Stitch or Photo Scan. There's other programs now. Metashape, I think, is the one that's most popular. But you can see that they actually made videos and used those videos to create this 3D image. And this is like being on the wreck. You can zoom in, you can see the features, how everything's kind of deteriorated. You can see the anti-aircraft guns amidship. You can see the depth charges on the deck actually still in their launchers. One of the rear guns has fallen out. The emplacement as the barrels have fallen out into the sand. But it's just, the technology is incredible. This takes a lot of processing technology. So when they were actually working on this, when we were in Malta in 2017, they had computers set up in their room with hard drives and fans and everything, because the amount of calculations necessary to render this type of an image is incredible. The processing capacity is huge. So this is the path of the dives they made. You can see the squiggly lines. That's all the video they took in the first dive, and there's another one coming up. And I believe there was a total of 6 dives they did to make all these videos to create this image. So the last part, where was the bell? We worked with the University of Malta to try to locate the bell and bring it up. When I say we, the tech divers who actually did the deep diving, Timmy Gambin from the University of Malta, Steve Wilkinson, Dave Gratian, guys like that who work with the University of Malta, my friend Sharky Alexander, and Peter Witkowski looked for the bell. Well, the red X is where the bell was supposed to be. The bell was not there. We had permission to bring the bell up and store it in the museum and archive it and actually have it on display in Malta. So where was the bell? Well, here you can see where it was supposed to be, where the X is, and where it actually was is where the red arrow is. And we didn't know that. But after several days of swimming around and trying to find it, they actually did locate the bell. I'm going to turn the volume up because it's funny. If you listen to the guys when they find the bell, they're breathing mixed gases, and one of those gases is helium. So it makes their voice sound kind of funny if you listen closely. Sounds like cartoon characters, but those are my friends when they found the bell. Here they illuminated. It was actually because the ship was on her side, on her port side, the bell was kind of cocked up into the side. So they ended up rigging this bell and wrapping it with cords and zip ties. And then the trick was how to get it off the rack, because the metal bracket that was holding it was so thick that they really didn't know what to do. Long story short, they ended up using hacksaws. We went to the corner hardware store. We bought a bunch of hacksaws, and they took turns in groups sawing the bracket to get the bell up. And this is when we were waiting for the bell to come to the surface. Came up on what's known as a lift bag, actually several lift bags. And what they do is they fill them at depth, and as they come up the line, the air in them, because of the decreasing pressure, expands, and it brings that object that you're surfacing, the bell in this case, to the surface. So here is when we actually got the bell up to the boat. This will just last a few seconds. This was probably the most exciting part for me, because we got it there. It was on the lift on the back of the boat. My heart was thumping and I was so excited. And then at one point it looked like, as it rolled to the back of the lift, I thought it was going to fall off the back of the lift and go back down. So I grabbed it. We were able to lift it up, and long story short, let me get it right up here. Everybody was so excited, high fives all around. And that's the bell. Pretty big sized bell. It was filled with silt, with mud accumulation that had been blowing into it for 73 years. The clanger, the part that goes ding dong, was still in it. This is a 360 rendering of the bell using that same 360-degree technology. So it kind of gives you that virtual reality. By the way, a lot of these types of images do work with like VR goggles. It makes them really cool. And you can see all the incrustation, all the stuff that's grown on it over the year. So this is where I wanted to get out real quick and go to the video of the bell conservation. And this is them working on it in Malta. And you'll notice they're using a torch, a blowtorch. And at first you're like, oh my gosh, they're going to burn it. But what this does,
I want to jump in for a second. Can you stop the screen share and reshare the video portion? Because right now we still see the presentation.
Oh, you know what? It's not going to work, unfortunately. Well, let's see. Stop share. Okay, let me try it again.
Yep. You can try sharing your whole desktop and that might work. The whole.
Gotcha. I will do that. Okay. So.
That's better.
Okay, great. So thank you for letting me know. So you can see that this is at the University of Malta. When I first saw this, and the funny story is I had not seen this until our annual workshop, when one of the marine archaeologists who was getting his master's at the University of Malta came to my workshop that we were running, our banquet, and she said, hey, I have the video of your dad's bell when we were cleaning it off. So long story short, here it is. I'm going to skip forward so you can see as they were finishing it up. They took the bracket off. You can see how thick that bracket is. I mean, it was so massive. And I was amazed that the guys even managed to saw through it in a few dives at that 300 feet deep on rebreathers with hacksaws. Just incredible. So that's them finishing that up. And they took the bracket apart. And there's the bracket when they had cleaned it up. So I'm going to stop this. I'm going to go back to the presentation so you can see what it looked like when she was all cleaned up. So here's on the right is the bell as it was cleaned up with the bracket removed. And you can see that nickel brass real bright and shiny as compared to what it was when we brought it off the wreck. Interesting thing about the wreck is that although it was given to the Polish Navy and renamed the ORP Kujawiak during the war, they didn't change the bell. A couple reasons, probably it was considered bad luck to change a ship's bell. Renaming a ship also wasn't the best luck, but also during the wartime, materials were very precious, and it's probably something that they wouldn't have prioritized. 2017, we had a plaque placed in the Upper Baraka Gardens in Malta, recognizing the 13 sailors who had died in a ceremony. And then we produced this report for the Explorers Club from the 4 expeditions. Two of them were Explorers Club flag expeditions. So that's about, I think, all I have time for today, just because I've gone long and I want to have everyone have enough time to ask questions. We did actually have an unsuccessful expedition that I won't talk about, but that happens sometimes. So far, it hasn't been successful yet. We're looking for World War II Polish and American bombers off of Brindisi, Italy, but that still may yield some results. So we're still waiting on that to see if we're able to find anything. So, want to go ahead and start with the questions, Joe?
All right, let's do it, Chris. Let's bring you back from that screen share so we can see you again.
All right.
And thanks for that great presentation. I mean, it definitely got me thinking of diving. My last dive before winter was in Lake Erie on a wreck called the Sun. So,
oh, cool. Awesome.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we can get some fills in the near future but who knows with everything that's happening right now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we do have a great group joining us. I can see we've got students from Connecticut as well as students from Illinois who are tuning in live via YouTube right now. And we have a couple of groups joining us on camera. So let's grab a few questions. Let's start with some camera action. So we've got Gavin, Jaden, and Declan joining us in New Hamburg, Ontario. Let me turn their mic on.
Oh, I thought it was Hamburg, Germany. Sorry. You guys probably laughed when I said that. It just, oh, I see New Hamburg. Gotcha.
Yes, wonderful information. We were curious, when you remove items from shipwrecks, if you need permission from the government or from, like, whose ownership is it? Obviously, you got permission for the bell.
Right. That's a great question. And it's one of the most common questions in maritime archaeology. And the answer is it depends. So in 1986, there was a Shipwreck Preservation Act that passed that essentially says in the United States, anything that's in state waters is under the jurisdiction of the state. So we don't remove a lot of things from Lake Erie. Sometimes you do. If you do, you have to go through a permit process, apply to the state, and make sure that that process is followed exactly. Otherwise, you can get in serious trouble. One of the things that is in great dispute now is that there's the distinction between treasure hunting and maritime archaeology or marine archaeology. And there are groups that are simply looking for gold or silver or platinum in some cases from the bottom of the ocean and trying to make a monetary benefit from bringing those things up. And there's a distinction between cultural preservation and bringing up items for display to share with the public and simply taking things like they used to do 40 years ago to put on your mantelpiece and show somebody how cool you are. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question and really good point. I have a lot of wrecks in the Great Lakes, and the Wexford comes to mind as one in Lake Huron where a lot of the artifacts have been taken. And it's unfortunate that people like to put them on their mantles and tuck them there, but it's much better when they're either preserved in place or somewhere where everybody can see them in a museum or something like that. All right. So Chris, let's hear a little bit about some of the training you had to do to become a maritime archaeologist.
So I have degrees in, I have a degree in political science and history. I have a master's in education to teach. And then I actually went ahead and, although I didn't really need to get another degree to do maritime archaeology, I've had a lot of experience doing it firsthand. I actually went back and got a second bachelor's degree in anthropology with an archaeology focus. And archaeology is one of the four branches of anthropology. There's linguistic anthropology, cultural anthropology, biological anthropology, and archaeology. And those are all subdisciplines of anthropology. So in addition to that, diving, I grew up in South Florida. Sadly, I didn't learn to dive until I moved to Ohio. And I know that sounds crazy because it's cold in Ohio and we have diving. You can dive year round in Ohio if you're brave and you want to ice dive. But I made it to the level of dive master, which is the lowest professional certification in PADI scuba diving. I've been on hundreds of dives in Lake Erie in Florida, where the water is much clearer and bluer, and other parts of the world. It's a lot of experience-based work. And because I'm an avocational marine archaeologist, maritime archaeologist, I don't do it for a living. It's a little different. So I can go at my own pace. If I wanted to be a working professional maritime archaeologist, more than likely in most cases, you have to go forward and get a master's degree. Not everybody does, it depends. But I don't have a master's in maritime archaeology. But diving is very key. Lots of diving under different conditions, whether it be cold water, dark water, muddy water, being able to multitask. So there's a lot of training involved and a lot of experience and a lot of safety, number one.
Yep. All right. I want to give a shout out to Maria in Greece. She sent a message in via the chat saying that she's watching from Greece and that she's a field archaeologist. So that's pretty darn cool.
Awesome.
So Chris, people noticed that the videos were really murky. What kind of safety precautions do you have to take when diving in those conditions?
So we talk about Braille diving, essentially, diving by touch. And a lot of that is actually what we do. It's called black water, dark water diving, where you may be on a wreck and you're literally working by feel. So we have redundancies. We have one light, we have two. We have obviously a spare octo, a spare second stage regulator to breathe through if something goes wrong with the first one. We're diving with other people. We're not diving alone. We're diving in pairs typically. We have protocols for weather changes. For instance, if you're diving on a silty wreck in Lake Erie, the weather can go from beautiful to terrible in 20 minutes. I'm sure you know that, Joe. And so one of the things we have to do is recall procedures. If you hear the engine on the boat rev deeply 3 times, that means conditions are worsening on the surface, come up now. And in that case, we would reel up our lines, secure all our gear, and head to the surface. When you're getting off the boat, there's a dive safety officer that's checking you out and checking you in. So you get in the water, you get a tag. It goes on your BCD. It says, I'm number 9. Number 9 is Chris. Chris went in at 12:02 with 3,200 pounds of air. And we know that Chris is going to be back up in 30 minutes. Divers are watching at front, or people are watching at the front of the boat. Divers on the line 30 minutes later. Great, we know we're good. If there's a problem, we would address that using whatever procedure. We have oxygen on the boat. We have trained emergency first responders. A lot of times we have nursing personnel or doctors that happen to be on board on these trips. So we're usually doing pretty well as far as safety goes, and we're very, very strict. We don't take any chances. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. So you have Sebastian tuning in. Sebastian is joining us from Ontario, Brant Street. And Sebastian is wondering about how do you apply for this job? So, at the beginning, you told us you were an educator. So how would somebody, maybe as a recreational diver, how would they go about becoming more serious about the diving they're doing to do these kind of surveys?
That's a great question. And I'm going to give you an example. There's a young lady who graduated from high school here in Cleveland, Ohio. She went on to get her degree in historic archaeology from Cleveland State University. And she was part of MAST for several years. She worked hard. She's very bright. And now she's actually on television. She just was on an episode of Drain the Oceans recently with the last slave ship and appeared on that. And this is, somebody who just studied hard and decided that, historical archaeology was something she wanted to make her life's passion. So if you work hard, you do well in school, the best course to study would be an anthropology undergrad degree with a focus in archaeology, and then a master's in maritime archaeology. And maritime archaeology is a very specific field, maritime and nautical archaeology. There are schools worldwide, but there's not a lot of them. There's about a dozen with really good master's programs in maritime archaeology, and these include Flinders in Australia, which offers a distance program, University of Malta, Texas A&M University, University of East Carolina University. In Florida, you have a couple in Florida that I can't think off the top of my head. Plymouth University in the UK. So there's lots of options. I'm sure, I don't know that there's any master's programs in maritime archaeology in Canada offhand. I don't recall any, but there may be. But it's a very limited field. Jobs are not plentiful, but usually what happens is people will get their do the master's focus, and then they'll end up working for a government agency, NOAA, one of the state systems as a state archaeologist. Tamara Thompson in Wisconsin, I'm pretty sure it's Wisconsin, she'll kill me if it's not, is a state maritime archaeologist there. So there are jobs available in the field for people who are interested, for sure.
All right. Let's check in with our group in New Hamburg, see if they have another question.
You have another question?
I don't have any questions.
We're really, really interested in, well, my son is very, very interested in battleships from the World Wars. Now, do you need to get as divers, do you need to get a license to go to these spots and explore them? Or is it?
So it depends on the spot. For the most part, most World War II shipwrecks are free and open to dive with certain restrictions, because they are ships of war and people died on them. They're considered war graves. And so they're treated with a little bit more respect than just a typical boat that you might find on the bottom of a lake, for instance. There are special permissions required to dive in places like Scapa Flow, which is in northern end of the UK. Truck Lagoon is one of the big draws for battleships or ships in general from World War II. So no, the only thing is it's not cheap. So if you want to go dive battleships, you've got to go a long way in a lot of cases. You'll have to pay to get on boats that take you to the site, to spend a couple, 2-3 days up to a week. You have to pay for your gear. Now, initial diving cost is not terribly prohibitive. A young person, you can get certified at 10 as a junior diver. You'll have a limit of 40 feet. And then as you get older, you can bring that up to recreational limits, which is 130 feet. And you can do all in with a decent set of gear and classes for probably just a little bit over $1,000. And the certification lasts for life. So when you're certified to dive, you're certified to dive. It's just good to keep up on your skills to keep current, and make sure that you use great safety precautions and have good gear that's well maintained.
All right, very cool. There's a great spot off the coast of North Carolina, the graveyard of the Atlantic. And I was diving there a few years ago and got to dive on the German U-boat U-352.
Yeah, U-352. And since you said U-352, I've got my U-352 hoodie on. I don't know if you got to see it. Cool. But I've never actually been on it because every time I go to dive it, the weather turns and we get blown out.
Yeah,
so,
we had terrible.
It's a long way to get to North Carolina. So the couple trips that I've made down, we've ended up diving on like the Carib Sea or the Shures or the Spar, which are great dives. North Carolina is famous for its sand tiger sharks that are there at various seasons of the year. And they're just these majestic, big, peaceful, harmless sharks that float around the wrecks. It's just amazing.
Yeah, we got lucky. We started the day with the Shures and the weather wasn't looking so good, but it cleared up a little bit. They felt confident enough. So we went in, and that was our second, was the U-352, which was pretty wild. Yeah,
there are some U-boats that are diveable off the coast of the United States, and that's probably one of the top ones.
All right. So Chris, let's finish off with your favorite wreck. Is there a wreck you just love going back to? Or maybe you already talked about it.
I really love the Salton, just because I was so heavily participated in it. And plus, at the time that I was doing the survey of the Salton, I was actually teaching at Collinwood High School, which is 3 miles from where the wreck sits. And when I used to tell my school students that 3 miles that way is a shipwreck that went down in 1864 and show them the photographs and the video, they would lose their minds. They just couldn't believe it, that there was something that was so amazing, so close by where they were. So I'd have to say the Salton is probably my favorite wreck, just because I have a lot of emotional attachment to it.
All right, very cool. I want to give a shout out to the groups who tuned in on YouTube today and the groups who will check out the event later today via the recording. Obviously, a shout out to the groups who joined us on camera today. Thanks for the awesome questions. And Chris, thank you for doing something I love, which is highlighting cold water diving, because a lot of people, they dive, they might do their 1 or 2 dives a year in the Caribbean or somewhere nice and warm, but there's so much cool stuff to find in the Great Lakes.
Absolutely.
And other spots that cold water diving is pretty awesome.
Agreed. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, no worries. Well, again, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we're going to sign off for today.
Bye, everybody.